The most feared man in New York wasn't dying because his enemies were stronger. He was dying because no one was brave enough to stay beside him. I never imagined that a single ordinary workday would lead me through the gates of the city's most heavily guarded estate, carrying nothing but a bucket, a stack of fresh towels, and the quiet hope that I could earn enough money to keep my little boy smiling for another month. My name is Claire Bennett, 28 years old, and until that morning, my biggest worry had been whether Ethan's favorite sneakers would survive another school year. Life had taught me to count every dollar, stretch every meal, and never expect kindness from people with power. That was why the enormous black iron gates unsettled me the moment the security guard waved me inside. Even the gravel beneath my worn shoes sounded too expensive. The mansion stood at the top of the hill, like something carved from another world. Marble columns framed the entrance. Perfect gardens stretched farther than I could see. Luxury surrounded every corner, yet the silence felt heavier than any hospital I'd ever visited. No music, no laughter, no conversation, just silence. A woman dressed in an elegant navy suit greeted me before I reached the front steps. Her smile looked practiced, as though she'd forgotten what genuine happiness felt like years ago. "You're the temporary housekeeper?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Claire Bennett." She glanced toward Ethan, who held my hand with both of his. His backpack bounced gently against his small shoulders. "Childcare canceled?" she asked without judgment. "Yes," I admitted quietly. "He's well behaved. He'll stay out of everyone's way." Ethan squeezed my fingers before looking up at me with the same bright blue eyes that always reminded me life still had reasons to keep moving forward. "I'll be good, Mom," he whispered. The woman studied him for another second before giving a slow nod. "Just don't let him wander upstairs." Something about the way she emphasized upstairs made a chill travel across my shoulders. As we entered the mansion, I immediately noticed the smell. It wasn't the rich scent of polished wood or expensive candles. It was antiseptic, medicine, fresh linens, the kind of scent that lingered in places where people were trying very hard not to lose someone. Staff members crossed the hallways quietly, avoiding eye contact with one another. A nurse hurried toward the front door, carrying a suitcase. Another followed minutes later, speaking anxiously into her phone. I overheard only a single sentence before she disappeared outside. "I'm sorry, but I can't come back." The words echoed in my mind. I watched another employee remove a tray of untouched food from an elevator. Soup, tea, medicine. None of it had been touched. "Does nobody stay?" I asked softly while folding clean towels onto a service cart. The woman in the navy suit hesitated. "Not anymore." Before I could ask another question, Ethan tugged gently on my sleeve. His voice was barely louder than a whisper. "Mom." I looked down and followed the direction of his tiny finger. At the very top of the grand staircase, one door stood slightly open. Behind it, I thought I caught the faint sound of someone struggling to breathe. The entire mansion seemed to hold its breath with him. Then Ethan looked at me with quiet concern and asked the question no adult inside that house had dared to ask all day. "Is the man in that room all alone?" I looked back toward the staircase, hoping Ethan would forget the question as quickly as children usually did, but he did not move. He simply kept staring at the half-open door with quiet curiosity instead of fear. That surprised me more than anything. Most adults inside the mansion avoided even looking in that direction. The housekeeper followed his gaze and let out a slow breath. "His name is Adrian Moretti," she said quietly. "You do not need to know anything else." Even speaking his name seemed to make the hallway colder. I had heard that name before, whispered by customers at the diner where I worked evening shifts, mentioned on local news whenever another business deal changed the skyline of Manhattan, always surrounded by rumors no one could prove. Powerful, untouchable, dangerous. Yet nothing about the silence upstairs sounded powerful. It sounded lonely. I lowered my voice. "Is he very sick?" The woman hesitated before answering. "The doctors say his body will recover if he wants it to. The problem is that he has stopped wanting anything." She turned away before I could ask another question, leaving me alone with words that refused to leave my mind. Ethan slipped his small hand back into mine as we began cleaning the east hallway. He worked beside me the way he always did, handing me folded towels and humming softly to himself. Ever since his father passed away 3 years earlier, he had insisted on helping whenever life became difficult. I often wondered how someone so young had learned compassion before learning multiplication. Hours passed quietly. Staff members moved through the mansion like shadows. Every conversation stopped the moment footsteps approached. Every tray sent upstairs returned almost untouched. Fresh flowers disappeared into Adrian's room each morning and came back wilted each evening. It felt less like caring for a patient and more like waiting for a season that refused to change. Around lunchtime, one of the cooks handed me a small container of chicken soup. "For your son," she whispered kindly. "He must be hungry." Ethan smiled with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am." He carried the warm container carefully to a quiet sitting room overlooking the gardens. Outside, late autumn leaves drifted across the stone paths while gray clouds covered the afternoon sky. Ethan stirred his soup without taking a bite. "Mom." "Yes." "If someone is sick, why do people keep leaving?" I searched for an answer that made sense to a 6-year-old. "Sometimes grown-ups become scared when they cannot fix something." He frowned. "Does leaving fix it?" I looked into his innocent eyes and quietly admitted, "No. It usually makes people feel even more alone." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. He took one spoonful of soup before setting it down. Then he picked up the container with both hands. "Can we give this to the man upstairs?" My heart skipped. "Sweetheart, we cannot do that." "Why not?" "Because those are not our rules." He looked toward the grand staircase again. Maybe nobody stayed because nobody asked what he needed. Before I could answer, footsteps echoed sharply through the hallway. A doctor emerged from the elevator carrying a medical bag. His tired face revealed everything before he spoke a single word. He removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and quietly told the waiting staff he refused every treatment again. No one responded. One by one, they lowered their heads and walked away. Ethan watched them disappear until the hallway became silent once more. Then he held the warm bowl against his chest, looked up at me with calm determination far beyond his years, and whispered, "Mom, I think he does not need another doctor. I think he just needs somebody to stay." I wanted to say no. Every instinct told me to pick up our cleaning supplies, finish the shift, and leave the mansion before sunset. That was what sensible people did around powerful men with complicated lives. They kept their heads down, earned their paycheck, and went home. But Ethan was already walking toward the staircase with the careful determination only children seemed capable of carrying. "Ethan," I called softly. He stopped and looked back, waiting instead of arguing. "We cannot bother him." "What if he is waiting for somebody?" he asked. I did not have an answer. The second floor felt even quieter than the first. Thick carpets softened every footstep, expensive paintings covered the walls, and sunlight filtered through tall windows without warming the endless hallway. As we approached the partially open bedroom door, I noticed something strange. Fresh flowers sat untouched on a nearby table. 3 meal trays waited outside the room, each one barely disturbed. Someone had replaced them throughout the day, but no one had taken them away yet. It was as if every person entered only long enough to perform a duty before escaping again. Ethan looked at the untouched trays and frowned. He really did not eat. Before I could stop him, he gently knocked twice on the heavy wooden door. No answer came. He waited several seconds before knocking again. Still nothing. He slowly pushed the door open another few inches and peeked inside. The room was enormous, yet it felt smaller because every curtain had been drawn halfway shut. Afternoon light rested across polished hardwood floors and bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes that looked as though they had not been touched in months. Near the windows stood medical equipment humming quietly beside an oversized bed. Adrian Moretti lay almost motionless beneath a gray blanket. He looked nothing like the larger-than-life figure I had imagined from whispered conversations around the city. His dark hair needed trimming. His face had become pale from weeks indoors. The confidence people associated with his name had disappeared beneath exhaustion that reached deeper than illness alone. He did not even seem asleep. He simply stared toward the ceiling without focusing on anything. Ethan stepped inside before I could pull him back. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure everyone in the mansion could hear it. "Sir?" Ethan asked gently. No response. "My name is Ethan." Silence. "My mom says soup helps people feel better." Adrian remained perfectly still. I whispered urgently, "Ethan, that is enough. Come here." But my son shook his head with quiet patience. He walked closer until he reached the side of the bed. Instead of speaking again, he carefully placed the small container of warm chicken soup on the bedside table. Then, With the simple kindness that only a child could offer without expecting anything in return, he rested his tiny hand lightly against Adrian's hand. "You do not have to eat now," he said softly. "I just did not want you to be by yourself." The room remained silent for one long heartbeat. Then another. I almost apologized for interrupting when I noticed the smallest movement beneath Ethan's fingers. Adrian's hand twitched. His breathing changed. Slowly, almost painfully, his eyes shifted away from the empty ceiling and settled on the little boy standing beside him. They stayed there, not for a second, but long enough for me to realize this was the first time anyone had truly reached him. Outside the bedroom, hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway. A nurse looked inside, froze in complete disbelief, and whispered toward someone behind her. He opened his eyes. Within seconds, more staff gathered outside the doorway, each one staring in stunned silence. None of them dared step inside. They simply watched as the man they had spent weeks trying to save continued looking at the one small visitor who had entered his room without fear, without obligation, and without asking for anything in return. I had expected someone to rush into the room the moment Adrian looked at Ethan. Instead, no one moved. The nurses remained frozen near the doorway. The security staff exchanged uncertain glances but kept their distance. Even the woman in the navy suit who seemed to control every detail inside the mansion stood perfectly still, as though everyone feared that the smallest interruption might shatter whatever impossible moment had just begun. Ethan smiled with the simple warmth only a child could offer. "Hi," he said softly. "I brought you soup." Adrian did not answer immediately. His gray eyes remained fixed on Ethan's face, studying him with quiet confusion, as if he were trying to remember something that had been missing for a very long time. His lips parted slightly before a tired whisper finally escaped. "How old are you?" The question was barely audible, but every person outside the room heard it. The nurse beside me covered her mouth with trembling fingers. "He spoke," she whispered. "He has not spoken to anyone in days." Ethan lifted 6 fingers proudly. "I turned 6 in April." Adrian blinked slowly, absorbing the answer. For the first time since entering the room, he shifted his gaze toward the bowl resting on the bedside table. It was such a small movement that another person might not have noticed it, but I did. So did everyone else. One of the nurses quietly stepped forward. "Sir, would you like to try a little soup?" For several long seconds, Adrian said nothing. Then he gave the slightest nod. The room seemed to exhale all at once. The nurse carefully warmed the soup before returning with a fresh spoon. Adrian accepted only 2 small bites before leaning back against the pillows, exhausted by the effort, yet something inside the room had changed. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt hopeful. Ethan climbed onto the chair beside the bed after looking at me for permission. I hesitated only a moment before nodding. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded sheet of paper covered with colorful crayon drawings. "I made this at school yesterday," he said. "That is me. That is my mom. And this is our apartment." Adrian studied the drawing much longer than anyone expected. "Where is your father?" he asked quietly. Ethan looked down for just a second before smiling again. "He lives in heaven now." The answer carried no bitterness, only honesty. Adrian lowered his eyes to the paper, his expression softening in a way that seemed almost unfamiliar to him. I watched his fingers tighten gently around the edge of the blanket before relaxing again. No one spoke for nearly a minute. There was no need. Sometimes kindness filled a room more completely than conversation ever could. As the afternoon faded into evening, the doctor returned to examine Adrian. His heartbeat had steadied. His breathing had become less strained. The doctor looked at the medical monitor, then back at Ethan, clearly unable to explain what he was seeing. "This is encouraging," he admitted. "Very encouraging." Word spread through the mansion faster than I thought possible. Staff members who had walked with heavy shoulders all morning now smiled cautiously at one another. Someone opened the curtains wider, allowing golden sunlight to spill across the room for the first time that day. Fresh air drifted in through a slightly opened window carrying the scent of autumn leaves. When it was finally time for us to leave, I thanked everyone quietly and reached for Ethan's backpack. "Come on, sweetheart. We have to catch the bus." Ethan stood and waved toward the bed. "Goodbye, Mr. Adrian. I can come back tomorrow if you want." Adrian looked toward the window for a brief moment before meeting Ethan's eyes again. His voice remained weak, but this time there was no hesitation. Please do. As we stepped into the hallway, every employee turned to watch us walk away. None of them looked at me with pity anymore. They looked at my little boy with something I had never expected to see inside that mansion. Hope. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Adrian's expression when Ethan mentioned his father. It was not pity that crossed his face. It was recognition. The kind that only comes from someone carrying an old wound no one else can see. By 6:30 the next morning, Ethan was already dressed in his blue sweater, waiting by our apartment door with his small backpack resting on his shoulders. Do you think Mr. Adrian remembered that I said I would come back? He asked while tying his sneakers. I smiled as I poured coffee into my travel mug. I think he probably did. The city bus crawled through morning traffic while sunlight reflected off the glass towers of Manhattan. Ethan spent the ride drawing quietly in a small sketchbook balanced on his knees. Every few minutes he glanced out the window before adding another tree, another bird, another smiling face. Children always seemed to draw the world the way they wished it could be instead of the way it was. When we arrived at the estate, something immediately felt different. The front gates opened before we even reached the security booth. The guards greeted Ethan by name. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere no longer carried the hopeless silence that had filled every hallway the day before. Employees spoke softly with one another. Fresh flowers decorated the entrance. Someone had opened nearly every curtain, allowing warm autumn light to spill across the marble floors. It was still quiet, but it no longer felt like a house waiting to say goodbye. As I prepared my cleaning supplies, the woman in the navy suit approached with a gentler expression than I had ever seen on her face. Mr. Moretti had breakfast this morning, she said. I stopped folding a towel. He did. She nodded. Not much. Toast. Tea. Half a bowl of oatmeal. It is the first real meal he has finished in weeks. She looked toward Ethan, who was carefully arranging his colored pencils inside his backpack. He also asked what time the little boy would arrive. I felt my breath catch. Powerful people were rarely imagined waiting for anyone, especially not a 6-year-old child. Yet there was no doubt in her voice. Ethan looked up with a bright smile. Can I show him my new drawing? I believe he would like that very much, she replied. When we reached Adrian's room, the door was already open. He sat upright against several pillows, still pale, but noticeably stronger than yesterday. A book rested on his lap, although it looked as though he had not read a single page. The moment Ethan appeared, Adrian closed the book and looked directly at him. Good morning, Mr. Adrian, Ethan said cheerfully. I brought another picture. Adrian's lips curved into the faintest smile. It was small enough that someone passing by might have missed it completely, but everyone inside the room noticed. Come in, he said. Ethan hurried over and unfolded his latest drawing across the blanket. This time there was a large house surrounded by trees, with 3 stick figures standing in front of it beneath a bright yellow sun. Adrian studied the picture quietly before pointing toward the tallest figure. Is that your mother? Ethan nodded proudly. She is the strongest person I know. Adrian looked toward me for only a second before lowering his eyes back to the drawing. I believe you are right. Something warm settled inside my chest. It had been years since anyone had spoken about me with such simple respect. Then Adrian surprised us both. He reached toward the bedside table, picked up a framed photograph that had been turned face down, and handed it carefully to Ethan. The picture showed a younger Adrian standing beside a smiling woman and a little girl who looked no older than 5. Their laughter seemed almost alive despite the faded colors. Ethan traced the edge of the frame gently. They look happy, he whispered. Adrian stared quietly at the photograph before answering with a voice softer than the autumn breeze drifting through the open window. They were my whole world. For a long moment, neither Ethan nor I spoke. Adrian continued looking at the photograph as though it belonged to another lifetime, one that had slipped through his fingers before he realized how precious it truly was. His thumb brushed gently across the edge of the worn frame, and I noticed that the glass had a tiny crack running through one corner. It had probably been dropped years ago, yet no one had replaced it. Some things, even when broken, become too important to change. Ethan carefully handed the picture back. They must have loved you very much, he said with complete sincerity. Adrian swallowed before answering. They did. His voice grew quieter. I spent so many years believing I could protect everyone by carrying every burden myself. I was wrong. The room fell silent again, but it was no longer an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind shared by people who finally understood that words were not always necessary. A gentle knock interrupted the moment. The family physician stepped inside carrying a clipboard, followed by the woman in the navy suit. The doctor smiled with cautious optimism after reviewing Adrian's chart. Your fever continues to come down. Your appetite is improving. If this progress continues, you may be walking outside within a week. Adrian gave a small nod, but asked only one question. Will they still be coming tomorrow? The doctor looked confused until his eyes shifted toward Ethan. If that is what you want, he replied with a smile. Adrian looked directly at me. Claire, I know you came here to work, not to sit beside an old man. But your son has given this house something that medicine could not. If it does not place a burden on your family, I would like to ask if you would both return. I hesitated. My cleaning job was temporary. My evening shifts at the diner barely covered rent. Bus fare alone was becoming difficult to manage. Before I could answer, the woman in the navy suit stepped forward. Mr. Moretti has already instructed us to make arrangements. Transportation will be provided. Your work schedule here will be adjusted, and your salary will reflect the additional responsibility. You will not lose income by accepting. I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. For months, I had been calculating every grocery bill down to the last dollar. Now someone was offering help without asking for anything unreasonable in return. Ethan tugged gently on my sleeve. Mom, he whispered with hopeful eyes. I think Mr. Adrian still needs a friend. I smiled despite myself. Then we will come. Something softened in Adrian's expression, almost like relief. The doctor finished his examination before leaving the room with the others, but just outside the doorway, I overheard two employees speaking quietly. Have you noticed? One asked. The staff is smiling again. The other nodded. It feels like the mansion is waking up. They were right. Fresh flowers had replaced fading ones throughout the halls. The piano in the library, silent for months according to one maid, had been opened that morning. Even the kitchen smelled different. Warm bread, cinnamon, and fresh coffee drifted through the corridors instead of antiseptic alone. Hope had a scent after all. Before we left that afternoon, Ethan walked back to Adrian's bedside one last time. Tomorrow I can bring my favorite storybook, he offered. Adrian looked at him with genuine interest. What is it about? Ethan grinned. A lonely bear who thinks nobody likes him until a little bird refuses to leave. Adrian let out the faintest laugh, barely louder than a breath, yet it filled the room more completely than any speech ever could. As we stepped into the hallway, I realized something extraordinary had happened without anyone noticing exactly when it began. We had entered that mansion as strangers hired to clean its floors. Somehow, without planning it, my little boy had begun cleaning something much harder to reach. A heart that everyone else had quietly given up on. The days settled into a rhythm that none of us had expected. Every morning Ethan packed a different storybook, another drawing, or a small puzzle into his backpack before we caught the bus into Manhattan. Every afternoon the mansion felt a little brighter than it had the day before. Adrian was sitting in a chair by the window now instead of remaining in bed, wrapped in a soft charcoal sweater instead of hospital blankets. The doctors smiled more often. The nurses no longer whispered outside his room. Even the house staff walked with lighter steps, as though hope itself had become another member of the household. One crisp Thursday afternoon, Ethan sat cross-legged on the carpet building a small castle from wooden blocks that one of the employees had found in a storage room. Adrian watched quietly from his chair, occasionally offering a suggestion that Ethan accepted with complete seriousness. That tower is too short, Adrian observed. Ethan laughed. It is supposed to be short. Every castle needs one funny tower. Adrian actually smiled. It was no longer the faint shadow of a smile I had first seen. It reached his eyes now, softening the years of loneliness that had settled there. I stood nearby folding fresh laundry when the woman in the navy suit entered carrying a folder. She stopped as soon as she noticed Adrian smiling. For a moment, she simply watched without speaking. Sir, she finally said, your board meeting has been postponed again. Adrian barely glanced toward the folder. Reschedule it for next week. She blinked in surprise. There are investors waiting. Adrian looked back at Ethan, who was carefully balancing another wooden block on top of the little castle. They can wait another week. After she quietly left, I could not hide my curiosity. I hope we are not causing problems for your work. Adrian shook his head. For years I convinced myself that every meeting was urgent. Every deal mattered. Then I became sick, and almost none of those people stayed long enough to ask how I was doing. He paused before looking toward Ethan. The only person who never asked me for anything was 6 years old. His words settled deeply inside me. They were not spoken with bitterness. They sounded more like someone finally seeing the truth after spending years looking in the wrong direction. That afternoon, Ethan finished building his crooked little castle and proudly placed a tiny wooden bear inside the tallest tower. Now he is not lonely anymore, he announced. Adrian stared at the toy bear for several seconds before quietly asking, "Do you know why I like your stories so much?" Ethan shook his head. "Because they always end happy." Adrian smiled gently. "Because every time you tell one, nobody wins by being stronger. They win by being kinder." Before Ethan could answer, one of the security officers knocked politely on the open door. "Sir, there are visitors requesting a meeting." Adrian's expression remained calm. "Tell them I am unavailable." The officer hesitated. "They insist it is important." Adrian looked toward the little wooden castle standing proudly on the carpet. Then he looked at Ethan, who was trying to decide where the tiny bird figurine should sit beside the bear. "This," Adrian said quietly, "is important." The officer gave a respectful nod and left without another word. I realized then that something remarkable had happened over the past week. The mansion had not simply become warmer because Adrian was recovering. Adrian was recovering because he had finally remembered what warmth felt like. And as golden afternoon sunlight filled the room, Ethan carefully handed the tiny wooden bear to Adrian and whispered, "You should keep him. Every castle needs somebody who remembers how to smile." By the beginning of the following week, the mansion no longer felt like a place trapped in endless winter. Fresh flowers lined the hallways every morning. The grand piano in the library played softly again as one of the older employees practiced during lunch breaks. Laughter, once almost forbidden inside those walls, now drifted through open doors whenever Ethan discovered another reason to smile. Even the garden seemed different. The maple trees had begun covering the stone paths with brilliant shades of red and gold, and Adrian insisted on walking outside for the first time since becoming ill. The doctor recommended only 10 minutes. Adrian managed nearly 30. Ethan proudly walked beside him, carrying the tiny wooden bear in one pocket and collecting colorful leaves in the other. I stayed a few steps behind, watching carefully in case Adrian became tired, but he surprised all of us. His shoulders stood straighter. His breathing was steady. Every few minutes he paused, not because he lacked strength, but because Ethan wanted to show him another squirrel racing across the lawn or another bird landing on the fountain. It occurred to me that recovery sometimes looked less like medicine and more like learning how to notice ordinary beauty again. As we reached a small gazebo overlooking the lake, Adrian lowered himself onto a wooden bench. Autumn. Sunlight reflected across the water, turning every ripple into liquid gold. Ethan climbed onto the bench beside him and placed several bright leaves into Adrian's hand. "These are my favorites," he explained. "You can keep them until next year." Adrian looked at the leaves for a long moment before smiling. "What happens next year?" Ethan grinned. "New ones grow." Adrian closed his fingers gently around the little collection. "I think that is a good reminder." We remained there quietly until the woman in the navy suit approached carrying a small envelope. "Sir," she said softly, "this arrived for you." Adrian opened it without concern, read only a few lines, then folded it again. I noticed his expression remained perfectly calm. "Is everything all right?" I asked after she stepped away. He nodded. "Someone wants me to return to the life I lived before I became sick." He looked toward the peaceful lake instead of the letter. "A month ago I would have left immediately. Today I realized something." Ethan tilted his head curiously. "What?" Adrian smiled. "There are some invitations that cost more than they are worth." Without another word, he handed the unopened letter back to the woman in the navy suit. "Please decline politely." She accepted it with quiet understanding. As she disappeared down the garden path, I realized every employee had stopped watching Adrian with fear. They now watched him with respect that came from somewhere deeper than authority. On our way back toward the mansion, Ethan suddenly reached for Adrian's hand. I instinctively expected Adrian to hesitate, but he did not. Their hands fit together naturally, one weathered by years of responsibility, the other impossibly small and warm. They walked side by side beneath the falling leaves without speaking. Sometimes silence carried more healing than conversation ever could. Later that afternoon, while I organized fresh linens upstairs, I overheard two longtime employees talking outside the study. "Do you remember how quiet this place used to be?" one whispered. The other smiled. "It was never quiet. It was lonely." I stood perfectly still because those simple words explained everything I had been unable to describe. The mansion had always been filled with expensive furniture, priceless artwork, and endless luxury. What it had lacked was the one thing no amount of money could ever purchase. Someone who stayed because they cared, not because they were paid. And as the evening sun poured through the windows, I watched Ethan place another crayon drawing beside Adrian's family photograph, where the two pictures rested together as though they had always belonged in the same frame. 3 months passed more quickly than I ever thought possible. Winter arrived gently, covering the gardens with a thin blanket of snow that sparkled beneath the morning sun. The mansion looked just as magnificent as it had on my first day, yet it no longer felt intimidating. It felt lived in. Warm fireplaces glowed throughout the halls. Fresh cookies baked almost every afternoon because Ethan insisted that everyone deserved dessert after lunch. The staff laughed openly now, no longer whispering through endless quiet corridors. Somewhere along the way, the estate had stopped feeling like a fortress and started feeling like a home. Adrian recovered completely. His doctors called it remarkable progress. They praised modern medicine, strict routines, and careful treatment plans. Adrian thanked every one of them with sincere gratitude. But later, while watching snowflakes drift beyond the library windows, he quietly admitted the truth to me. "Medicine gave my body another chance," he said. "Your son reminded my heart why it should keep beating." I smiled, unable to find words worthy of answering that sentence. Some gifts were simply too large for conversation. A week before Christmas, Adrian invited the entire staff and their families to dinner inside the grand ballroom. Long wooden tables replaced formal arrangements that had once separated employees from executives. Children ran between decorated Christmas trees, while soft piano music filled the room. Ethan proudly helped place homemade paper snowflakes along the windows, explaining to anyone who would listen that real decorations looked better when little hands made them. Nobody disagreed. After dinner, Adrian stood near the fireplace holding a small wrapped box. He looked unusually nervous, something I had never imagined possible. "Ethan," he called gently. My son hurried over with bright eyes. Adrian handed him the gift. Inside rested a beautifully carved wooden bear, almost identical to the tiny toy Ethan had given him weeks earlier, except this one stood beneath a carved oak tree. On the base were simple engraved words. "Thank you for staying." Ethan hugged the little carving tightly before doing something that made every person in the room fall silent. He stepped forward and wrapped both arms around Adrian. "You are welcome, Mr. Adrian," he whispered. Adrian closed his eyes for just a moment before returning the embrace with gentle care. There was nothing dramatic about it. No applause. No grand speech. Just a quiet moment between a lonely man who had forgotten how to hope and a little boy who never believed hope disappeared in the first place. Later that evening, as guests prepared to leave, Adrian walked me to the front entrance beneath strings of warm white lights. Snow drifted softly around us. "Claire," he said, "I spent years believing strength meant standing alone. I built walls high enough that nobody could reach me. Then your son walked through an open door carrying nothing except a bowl of soup and a kind heart. He accomplished what wealth, influence, and fear never could." He looked toward Ethan, who was laughing with several employees while showing them how to build a snowman. He reminded me that the richest people are not the ones who own the most. They are the ones who never let another person feel alone. I looked across the snowy courtyard, remembering the frightened little boy who had asked one simple question on our first day. Is the man in that room all alone? It turned out that question had changed every life inside those walls, including my own. As we drove home that night, Ethan fell asleep with the wooden bear resting safely in his lap and a peaceful smile on his face. Watching the city lights pass beyond the bus window, I finally understood something I would carry with me forever. Some people spend their entire lives searching for someone powerful, enough to rescue them. Sometimes, the greatest miracle arrives in the smallest hands, carrying nothing more than kindness, courage, and the willingness to stay when everyone else quietly walks away.